Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the problem of nature versus nurture, one of the biggest questions in philosophy of biology. First of all, I should say that biologists and other scientists often frame this in terms of a distinction between innate and acquired traits. The innate traits are nature, as it were. The acquired traits are those produced by nurture, by the environment. So in this video I'll often talk about innate versus acquired traits. Of course, this debate is of great relevance for philosophy in general. Historically, one of the great divisions in philosophy was between the rationalists like Descartes and the empiricists like Locke and Hume, where the empiricists denied that there are any innate ideas or innate concepts. The mind is a blank slate and all our ideas are ultimately derived from sense experience. Of course, before you try to evaluate positions like this, well, we need to have some understanding of what innateness even is. What does it mean to deny or affirm that there are innate ideas? So this is a very important debate and for anybody interested in philosophy. So, what does it mean to say that a trait is innate, that a trait is a product of nature rather than nurture? Well, the most popular view is what we might call the genetic criterion. So I guess in the sort of standard usage of the term, innate traits are those that are in some sense present at birth, or at least the disposition to develop the trait is present at birth. Now, of course, there are many innate traits that are not actually expressed at birth. One's hair colour would seem to be innate, but at birth you might not have any hair, or consider certain diseases that develop later in life, like Huntington's disease, usually starts showing symptoms only when the person is over 30. It's not so much that the trait itself is present at birth, but some cause of the trait is there at birth. It's just the trait may not yet be manifesting itself. And of course, the obvious option here is the genes. Innateness has something to do with genetics. So very broadly speaking, we tend to think that nature is what is, in some sense, in the genes, whereas nurture is what is caused by the environment. So on this view, the innate-acquired distinction is just the gene-environment distinction, where of course we should bear in mind that environment refers to everything other than the genes. So that can include, I guess, the chemical environment of the cell, say. So I think this probably captures how most people these days think about innateness, right? Innate traits are those traits that are produced by or coded in the genes. Now, the first thing to say about this is that every biologist nowadays accepts what is known as the interactionist consensus, which is the idea that all traits arise due to the interaction between genes and the environment. And actually, when you think about it for even a second, this is kind of trivial, right? Obviously, a lone sequence of DNA in a vacuum is not going to develop into anything. Similarly, if you were to take a cell without any DNA, it won't develop either. So it's pretty obvious that for any trait, both genes and environment must be involved. So as I say, this is kind of a trivial point, but it does have a couple of important consequences for this genetic definition of innateness. The first is that to say that something is caused by the genes, or to say that something is in the genes, that doesn't imply that it's impossible to change. Many people assume that if something is innate, if something is a matter of nature, then it's fixed and there's nothing we can do to change it. But that must be false. No traits are determined by the genes because they will all involve some environmental input. So if we conclude, for example, that men are innately more violent than women, well, there's no need to take a fatalistic attitude towards male violence. There would, at least in principle, be ways of altering the environment so as to make them less violent. Just imagine if we had a policy of putting all men on some sort of calming pill. Well, then they'd be less violent, even if they were innately more violent. Again, I think actually this point is also a fairly trivial one, but it's just, it's worth bearing in mind, just because in the sort of common discussions of innateness, I think a lot of people tend to think of innate traits as those that are in some sense fixed, but that can't be right. A second consequence of the interactionist consensus is it immediately raises the question, well, what on earth can it mean to say that some traits are in the genes whereas other traits are given by the environment? If genes or environment are involved in every trait, if they both cause the trait, then how can we draw a distinction here? So I guess the standard answer to this question is the idea of traits being encoded in the genes. Most people think of genes as providing a kind of blueprint for the organism. In architecture, a blueprint lays down the general structure of a building, right? So the actual building can have all kinds of features that aren't in the blueprint. The blueprint might not tell us the colour of the walls or the arrangement of seats in a room. So by analogy, some traits such as eye colour are encoded in the genes, encoded in the blueprint of the organism, whereas other traits such as music taste are not. Now in both cases, the right environment is required for the traits to actually develop, but this is just like how you need more than just the blueprint of a building to get an actual building. This is of course compatible with the interactionist consensus. When we say that traits are encoded in genes, we're not really making a causal claim. Both genes and the environment cause the traits, but we can think of the environment as kind of helping to bring about the plan that is given in the genes. So a trait is innate if the information for that trait is encoded in the genes, if it's in the genetic blueprint, and that does give us, I think, a pretty clear idea of the distinction between nature and nurture. We divide traits into those that are encoded genetically and those that are not. That's a clear enough distinction. The main problem is genes just don't work like that. Now, biologists do, of course, talk about genetic information. You've probably heard them talk about the genetic code, but it's important to be clear about what this means. Broadly speaking, there are two types of information. There are two ways the term information is used in the literature. It's important not to conflate them. So first of all, there's a purely correlational concept of information, which has been developed in detail by Claude Shannon, and so sometimes known as Shannon information. Consider, for example, forest fires and smoke in the air. So forest fires and smoke in the air surrounding the forest are correlated with each other. If you see a forest fire, this raises the probability that there is smoke in the air. If you see smoke rising above the trees, this raises the probability that there is a forest fire. The smoke carries information about the fire because it's a predictor of the fire. Broadly speaking, then, if you have two variables where the value of one variable is associated with the value of the other, then we say that the first variable carries information about the second, and the second carries information about the first, in a purely kind of correlational sense, in the sense that you can sort of use one variable to predict the other. It's quite clear that in this sense, genes carry information about traits. Genes and traits are correlated with each other. Some people are taller than others. Well, you can find genes that will be involved in causing that difference. Now, of course, this doesn't provide any basis for a distinction between innate and acquired traits, because environmental influences also carry correlational information about traits. Height also correlates with diet, for example. Just as there are correlations between traits and genes, there are correlations between traits and features of the environment. So that's one sense of information. On the other hand, when we think of genes encoding traits, we're usually talking about information in a fairly rich semantic sense. The blueprint of a building carries information in the sense that it semantically specifies a certain product, namely the structure of the building. It makes no difference how the blueprint is actually used. It doesn't matter how the blueprint correlates with other variables or what causal relations it enters into. We might not even bother to create the building. we might just stick the blueprint in a drawer and forget about it. But the semantic information is still there in the blueprint. When we say that that innate traits are those encoded in the genes, those in the genetic information, we're using this sense of information. Now, the trouble is that genetic information in this semantic sense is specific to the relation between genes and amino acids. Every DNA codon, a codon is a sequence of 3 nucleotides, so every DNA codon will be translated into a specific amino acid, as shown in this image here. Then a sequence of those amino acids builds a protein. The DNA provides a code, and there is a specific cellular machinery that, in a sense, reads the code and constructs the proteins on that basis. So it's quite reasonable to think of genes as coding for proteins, as, I guess, providing a blueprint for proteins. Now, actually, there are some snags here, because there are processes like alternative splicing that allow the same DNA sequence to produce different proteins. But I think that, this kind of this idea of genetic code is basically reasonable, I think, because it is the case that if for instance you have CTT in the DNA, and if we take that as if that's where it starts reading, if the cellular machinery sort of starts reading at that point, then you're going to get a particular specific amino acid from that. So most biologists are quite happy to say that there is a genetic code in that sense. The problem is that any kind of literal sense of coding ends here. Sequences of proteins don't code for traits. They go off and join a sort of soup of complex cellular processes. We can't link phenotypic traits to DNA sequences in the way that we can link proteins to DNA sequences. For one thing, there is no one-to-one relationship between genes and traits. We often find that a single gene will influence many seemingly unrelated traits. This is known as pleiotropy. The classic example is sickle cell anemia. So there's a genetic mutation which confers malaria resistance, but which also leads to deformed hemoglobin. So people who are homozygous for that gene, so people who have 2 copies of the mutated allele, well, because they don't produce normal hemoglobin, and this is a serious blood disorder, sickle cell anemia. So we get situations like this where we have one gene influencing many traits. Furthermore, any single trait will be influenced by many genes. With many traits, there are going to be so many genes involved across many different chromosomes. The interactions will be so complex, it won't really make sense to single out any particular gene. That's probably the case with something like sexual orientation, for example. We sometimes hear about people having found a gene for homosexuality, but it seems kind of unlikely that something like sexual orientation is just going to be a matter of you're just going to be able to identify a kind of single gene involved in that. It's probably going to be a whole host of different influences interacting in this very complex causal web. Another point to bear in mind here is that many traits emerge due to what we might think of as a kind of failure in the genome. Consider blue eyes. Eye colour depends on the amount of melanin pigment in the iris. Now, there is no blue pigment. Blue eyes arise simply from a failure to produce melanin. The blue colour is because of just the interaction of light with the structure of the eye. Basically, the longer, redder wavelengths are absorbed by the epithelium, and the shorter, bluer wavelengths are scattered back out, just as what happens in the blue of the sky. So, blue eyes are an absence of pigment. And there are various ways that genes can mutate so that the production of pigment in the iris is disrupted. All that's happened here then is that the kind of what we might think of as the normal development has been disrupted. Humans. I think that the kind of evolutionary story here is that when we were living in Africa in very hot countries, hot sun, you need the melanin pigment it gives protection to the eyes. But then, of course, as humans moved out into the higher latitudes, into colder areas, that protection was sort of no longer needed, and so there was no longer any selection that was maintaining that trait in the population, and so mutations were able to accumulate. So it kind of doesn't seem to make much sense to say that there's a gene for blue eyes. Presumably nobody would say that blue eyes are an acquired trait, but all that's sort of going on is a kind of failure in the genome. So those are some difficulties for the idea of genes encoding traits. Maybe an even more serious problem with this idea is that genes and environment interact in a non-additive way. So genes will have very different effects in different environments. I think it's best to explain this with an example. So here's an example from Brian Garvey's Introduction to Philosophy of Biology. Suppose we have two plants, one taller than the other. The tall plant has genotype A and the small plant has genotype B. We might suppose that A is a gene for tallness, say. Now, a natural assumption is that, okay, even if there's an interaction between genes and environment will sort of have the same influence in either case, right? The genes will have the same influence in either case. Let's say that our plants are adapted to low altitude conditions, so they grow best in low altitude conditions. So at a low altitude, let's say the first plant is 17 centimeters, the second plant is 12 centimeters, whereas at a high altitude, the first plant is 14 centimeters, the second plant is 9 centimeters. What we find then is that we have a taller plant and a shorter plant, and in both altitude conditions, the plant that's sort of tallest at one altitude is also tallest at the other altitude, even though the height changes. So this pattern of interaction between genes and environment is represented by what biologists call a norm of reaction. This is it's just a way of sort of visualizing interaction between genes and environment. It plots the expression of a gene against environmental conditions. In the case described, we have a norm of reaction like this. Across the top here, we have 7 different possible genotypes. Right? A produces the tallest plants and G produces the smallest plants. And in all cases, we see that moving to higher altitudes causes the plants to get smaller. Now, in this kind of case, it, I guess, makes some sense to talk about a gene for tallness. Right? This is because the gene makes a constant difference across the range of environments we've considered. So A, for example, produces taller plants relative to the other genes in all of these altitudes. In the same environment and other things being equal, right, having A will make you taller than having G. So maybe the idea of sort of a gene for tallness makes some sense here. The problem is that in most cases, the norm of reaction looks more like this. So, in other words, suppose we put all plants in the same environment at a low altitude. Plants with genotype A grow tallest, and those with G grow the smallest. And we've sort of ordered them in a nice, neat way so that B is slightly smaller, C is smaller still, and so on. Now, the trouble is that if we increase the altitude, this ordering will no longer hold. Increasing the altitude may reduce the height of some plants while increasing the height of others. So you can see in this case it increases the height of D and F. The plants that grow tallest in the low altitude environment may be smaller than others in high altitudes. I don't think this is particularly surprising, but obviously this kind of non-additive interaction seriously complicates any attempt to define innateness in terms of genetics. I mean, in this kind of case, it really doesn't seem to make much sense at all to talk about a gene for tallness, a gene that produces, that encodes, say, a particular trait, because what the gene does is going to change depending on the environment, how it relates to other genes changes depending on the environment. So can we sort of save the idea of genetic encoding, the genetic criterion of innateness? Well, one, I guess, final option, one notion that's associated with the genetic criterion of innateness and that you might think we could appeal to here is heritability. When people discuss innateness, they often talk about traits being more or less heritable. Now, heritability is a technical notion. I think there's quite a lot of confusion among lay people about what it actually means. So heritability scores traits with a value between 0 and 1, and I think many people tend to assume that this tells us how much of the trait is due to the genes. For example, if a study finds that IQ, say, has a heritability of 0.7, they think that this means that IQ is 70% caused by the genes or 70% innate. Now, that's just nonsense. To put it simply, what heritability measures is, for some trait in some population, how much of the variation in that trait can be correlated with genetic variation in the population. Or more technically, as Matteo Memelli and Patrick Bateson put it in their article, Innateness in the Sciences, heritability measures, and I quote, the ratio of the variance of the phenotype due to genetic variation to the total variance of the phenotype in the population. Maybe a more intuitive way to put it is that heritability measures how much of the variation in the trait can be explained by genetic variation. So if in some population the variation in some trait X is entirely due to genetic factors, then the heritability of X is 1. If the variation is entirely due to environmental factors, the heritability is 0. I think a good thought experiment that illustrates how this works is, so let's suppose we're studying the heritability of IQ. Well, first of all, suppose that we're looking at a population which is genetically uniform. So we have a population of clones. Well, in that case, the heritability of IQ would be 0. Indeed, the heritability of all traits would be 0, because none of the differences in IQ could be correlated with differences in the genes, right? Because there just are no differences in the genes. On the other hand, suppose we have a population of people with different genes who were raised in a uniform environment. Now, of course, you could never make the environment completely uniform, but this is just a thought experiment, so let's pretend that we can. Well, in this case, the heritability of IQ would be 1. All of the differences in IQ would have to be due to genetic differences because there are no environmental differences. So the crucial points about heritability is, first of all, heritability is defined relative to a particular population. It's dependent on the general the genetic structure and the environment of that population. The heritability of your IQ, say, will change depending on how we define which population you're in. If we were to look at the population of your town, well, your IQ may well have a different heritability than if we were to consider you as part of the population of your country. So it really is just nonsensical to assume that if a study shows that IQ has a heritability of 0.7, this shows that IQ is 70% genetic or 70% innate, right? The innateness of a trait shouldn't change depending on the population, but heritability does. I mean, so a specific example of this kind of thing is, so consider a disease which I think is pronounced phenylketonuria, or PKU. This is a serious disorder. It's caused by a genetic mutation that impairs a person's ability to metabolize the amino acid phenylalanine. And this results in a buildup of phenylalanine in the blood, which causes mental retardation and seizures and other problems. In many populations in the past, possession of the PKU genetic mutation will explain all of the variance between those who have PKU and those who don't, right? So in those populations, PKU is completely heritable, 100% heritable. But now we know that PKU can be treated with supplements and a special diet. So this diet prevents the accumulation of phenylalanine, and so it prevents the disease. So if you look at modern populations, many people with the PKU mutation will not have PKU. So there won't be a perfect correlation between the genetic variants and the phenotypic variants. Okay, hence the heritability will be lower. So that's just a specific example of kind of how the heritability of a trait will change depending on what population you're looking at. A second point is that heritability doesn't apply to invariant traits. Heritability measures how much variation in a trait is explained by genetic variation. So if there is no defined variation in the trait, it makes no sense to ask about how heritable it is. If all the organisms in a population have 4 limbs, we can't measure the heritability of limb number. Though of course it would be possible to make a more fine-grained distinction. You know, we could maybe measure the heritability of length, say, you know, limb length. But yeah, the point is that you have to define some variation first. So I don't really think that it's plausible that this concept of heritability is going to save the genetic encoding criterion of innateness. Heritability is not innateness. It's a different notion, which is certainly important, but it's not innateness. Well, for those of you who are still persuaded by the genetic encoding view of innateness, even given all these problems, a final question that's worth thinking about is, whose genes count? Humans live symbiotically with numerous microbes. There are microbes throughout our bodies, the so-called human microbiome, and these microbes are very important for normal development and functioning. Disrupting the normal bacteria in the gut, for example, can cause all sorts of problems with digestion. Presumably, digestion is innate, but the functioning of digestion can't be coded entirely in the human genome because it's a symbiotic process. It doesn't just involve human cells, it involves all of these bacterial cells as well. So I guess one thought might be, well, you know, you have to take both the human genome and the bacterial genome genomes together. So digestion is innate because it's kind of encoded in both genomes considered together. I think that's kind of an odd view to take because presumably those bacterial genomes are themselves acquired, right? After all, every human begins life as a single eukaryotic cell, which and then the human grows by cell division. You pick up the bacteria as you develop. So it's not obvious what defenders of the genetic view should say about this kind of case. And of course, this isn't unusual. In the course of normal development of any animal, there will be constant interactions with microbes. Microbes are kind of everywhere. So I think what all of this shows is that there are very serious problems with defining innateness in terms of the genes, in terms of genetic encoding. It seems to me that the genetic criterion is fairly implausible as a way of thinking about innateness. I should say maybe, I think part of the allure of genes here is that genes are certainly very useful, right? Because they can be reliably manipulated in quite precise ways. And at least for some traits, you can specify a kind of single gene which you can use to manipulate that trait. If you think about something like sickle cell anemia, well, we can identify a specific DNA sequence that causes the sickling abnormality in the hemoglobin molecule, and that also confers malaria resistance. So if you just alter that gene, if you replace the sickling allele with a normal allele, we could cure sickle cell anemia. In general, it's hard to control environmental variables nearly as precisely. So genes are very useful given the sort of mechanistic framework of modern science. But it's hard to get a definition of innateness out of genes, I think. So that's one view of innateness. We will look at some other attempts to define innateness in later videos, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching.